Hey everybody, today we are going to be taking a look at a Regirock deck from the 2004 format. We saw this deck pop up a couple of times in the Jay Plays video, but it's not a deck that we've covered on the channel. Now, while the list is mine that we're covering today, the main idea was not. The first person I saw play it was Jack on TCG1, the same guy who won the 2004 tournament with Crobat Gorbis. And the original credit for the deck, like I said, is going to go to him. But his list, I think, was pretty different from what my list is. He played his list with Blossom to try to counter the water weakness of Regirock. And his supporter and trainer lineup was pretty different too. The reason that I went with Xatu, and I guess before I get too much into the deck here, I'm going to be very upfront and say this is not a tier 1 deck. This is probably not even a tier 2 deck. This is probably a high tier 3 deck. Maybe you can make an argument for a very low tier 2 deck. The deck has a lot of strengths, but it also has a lot of weaknesses in the current format. And the biggest one by far is that your main attacker is weak to water. And Gorbis is one of the most commonly played decks in the format. Swampert is incredibly popular as well. And then even other decks such as Gardevoir and Blaziken that can consistently deal 100 plus damage in one turn are going to give the deck troubles at times as well. Now, what the deck excels against is going to be decks that A, are either going to be fighting weak, such as X-Plowed and Shiftry, and B, decks that aren't able to deal a consistently large amount of damage every single turn, like Team Magma decks, for example. Team Magma aims to just be a very quick, aggressive deck, but typically it's maxing out at anywhere from 50 to 80 damage. And as long as you're not hitting for a full 100 damage, Regirock is going to be able to deal with those type of decks very well. Now, I'm going to say Regirock plays differently than Muck, but I see some crossovers with the deck as well, where essentially you are taking advantage of some of the general inconsistencies of the format. You usually keep your hand size very low, making opposing copycats very weak. In the early stages of the game, your bench is usually very small as well, making Steven's advice very weak. So a lot of the times, the deck, outside of the matchups the deck does well against, a lot of the games you win, you're going to find it because your opponent struggles to set up. And I will say, I would say against decks like Blaziken and Gardevoir and Swampert, I think those are decks that should do very well against Regirock, but at the exact same time, I also feel like those are decks that you can take games off of surprisingly more often than you would think, just because they're going to struggle to set up versus your deck. And I feel like I'm explaining that kind of poorly, but it just generally, like, if decks aren't able to get strong Steven's advices off, if they're not able to get strong copycats off, and it's very hard for them to chain cards together to get set up, and you're hitting for 60 to 80 damage on turn 3, you can usually just steamroll those decks. Now, if the opposite's true and they're able to get set up, they hit a very early Delcatty, and from that they're able to hit, Magneton, and they're set up without playing a ton of supporters or relying very heavily on getting massive draws off copycats or Stevens, you're going to be in for a rough matchup. So, before we go too much further, let's just kind of cover the deck. And essentially, the deck is based around Regirock. This is the only attacker in the deck. And the idea is you just throw 3 energy under it. You hit for 60 damage. If you need to, you can hit for 80 damage. But the main strength in the deck comes from Healing Stone, where you're able to heal 10 damage off in between turns. So essentially, this is like a built-in Nidoqueen. You're healing basically 20 damage off just from the body before your opponent gets another turn. To add on to that, we also play Xatu. This is also going to heal 10 damage off So essentially between Regirock and Xatu, that gives us a possible 60 damage to heal per turn. This is a pretty solid number for the 2004 format. On top of that, we also play 4 Buffer Piece to reduce the damage being dealt to us even further. And then we just play a whole host of basically cards to mess with our opponent. And the number one question, I guess, is why is this deck better than Muck? And to be honest with you, it's probably not. It's got some advantages over Muck. It hits for more damage more consistently. But I think when you are really trying to take advantage of the inconsistencies in the format, Muck plays a lot better. Being able to shut off cards like Delcatty, Magneton, deny your opponent those draws, deny your opponent those energies. While Regirock, on the other hand, relies solely on just making sure your opponent can't get set up. Now, to kind of get back to my original thought, the reason that I think the Xatu variation of the deck is better than, say, the Blossom variation, which seems to be the most commonly played one on the ladder right now, is I feel like you're playing Blossom to try to counter Gorbis. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's going to matter. If against a strong Gorbis deck, you're just never going to be able to attack with Regirock, and playing a thin Blossom line against a Gorbis deck is never going to work out well for you, especially when Gorbis is always put with a partner like Crobat or basically just anything. Metagross is another common one. So in those situations, I feel like it's better to play just a very consistent Regirock deck and bolster your positive matchups while just taking losses. Maybe you're going to lose to Gorbis regardless. Maybe this deck loses harder to Gorbis, but you're going to lose to Gorbis either way. That's just my thought process on it. Same thing with Safeguard. You know, you can make an argument, well, geez, Jay, this loses to Wobbuffet, this loses to Ninetales. But essentially, those are such fringe outs, or such fringe cards in the current format, that I would rather just take my losses to those and then just bolster my other matchups. I'm going to, maybe increase my Blaziken matchup by a little bit, increase my Gardevoir matchup by a little bit. Sure, maybe that slightly decreases my chance of beating a deck that plays Wobbuffet, but I'm going to run into far more Blaziken decks than I am Wobbuffets. So, starting off here, for Regirock, we want to open with this as much as possible. Make sure that we're getting that turn 1 energy drop. You're going to see it's a pretty massive difference from getting a turn 1 energy drop to a turn 2 energy drop, because that's the difference between a turn 3 attack and turn 4 attack. Other than that, I think we've covered basically everything. Unfortunately, 100 hit points is just enough to trigger Desert Ruins. And then, even though the body would take the Ruins damage off, that's not how we want to use the body. We want to be using that to heal our opponent's attack damage. And then, Tonnage is okay. The downside is being able to hit for 80 is nice, but the problem is 80 doesn't really get us anywhere in the format. You still are two-shotting most larger EXs in the format, and you can't one-shot problematic Pokemon such as Blaziken, for example. Even with the Strength Charm, you're not going to be able to one-shot Ruby Sapphire Blaziken or Ruby Sapphire Gardevoir, and we're still 30 damage shy of not one-shotting a Swampert. So there is a lot of weaknesses there. Like I said, I think if the attack was 60 damage plus 30 more, it would be a lot stronger. It'd give the deck a lot more options, but unfortunately it's not. However, like I said, in this format, consistently hitting for a turn 360 can be incredibly strong. I play 4 Natu. This is honestly just the best Natu. Get that initial 10 damage on the board. Smoothing Wave, I guess if you do have the multi or psychic, can also be good in a pinch as well. And then for Xatu, I think players get really comfortable playing Blossom, but I think in a lot of these strong, fast stage 1 decks or basic decks, Xatu is just a better choice. Not only does it give you a free retreater, but it's a lot easier to set up. We don't have to play cards like Rare Candy. So beyond that too, a couple of things I want to note about the Xatu line. I think you can make an argument to play like a 3-3 Xatu and then either play some additional item cards or some additional supporter cards. But one of the things I do want to note here is when we're playing a deck that is trying to stop our opponent from setting up, and we're already talking about, taking advantage of our opponent getting very weak Stevens, getting very weak copycats off of us, the last thing we want to do is give our opponent 3 or 4 mulligan draws at the start of the game. So if we say, let's say, just play a quad Regirock deck, just 4 Regirock and then some potions and Moo Milks and stuff over the Xatu line, the odds of us mulliganing are going to be much higher. So at least with this, we do play a total of 8 basics to open with, and that's going to decrease our mulligan, the number of times we mulligan significantly. I still do find myself mulliganing with this deck, but it's less often than when I was playing fewer basics. The other thing I want to note about Xatu, which I think is very strong, is once again, we want to be attacking with Regirock as quickly as possible. Xatu, if we do open with the Natu, the Xatu is free retreat. So as long as we're able to find that Xatu by the 3rd turn of the game, we can still put that Regirock in the active spot and we don't have to pay an energy to retreat. This is another advantage, in my opinion, over Blossom, where you just can't get out of retreating that Blossom. You'd have to find a switch or a warp point or pay the energy to retreat the Oddish or the Gloom. No, I play 4 copies of Steven's Advice, absolutely essential in this format. 4 copies of Desert Shaman, same line of thinking that we did with the Muck deck, where we just want to put our opponent at a low hand size and then take away their options of drawing out of it. Especially with this deck, we need so little to set up. Like as long as we have a Regirock in play and we're dropping an energy every turn, we're happy. Obviously, most of the other decks in the format don't operate on that simple of a scale. 4 copycats. I keep going back and forth between Copycat and then Professor Oak's Research. There's pros and cons to both. Essentially, when we're trying to keep our opponent at a small hand size, Copycat is supposed to be much weaker. In reality, though, if our opponent is able to draw out of that situations, or they're able to hit a Steven's Advice, or they're able to get that Delcatty going, the Copycat does give us more options. Like it's more likely we're going to draw 6 cards or 7 cards or 8 cards off of a Copycat. The downside is there's also going to be those games where our opponent has 3 cards in their hand or 4 cards in their hand, and it's going to be weaker than Professor Oak's Research. Right now, I am going with 4 Copycat, 2 Oak's Research. I think there's a lot of different things you could do with these spots. I think you could do a 3-3 split. I think you could play 4 Oak and then like an Underground Expedition in there and just not play Copycat at all. I think you go, like I said, 4 Oak, 2 Copycat. There's just a lot of different options with the deck. Right now, this is what I'm playing, and it's playing all right. There's definitely situations where I'd rather have the Oak, I'd rather have the Underground Research, but there's also games, especially in the mid to late game, where I'm already up in prizes, and I'm just trying to find that game-winning reversal, or hit those ER2s just to keep my opponent at bay, that I do find Copycat to be stronger in those situations. For Pokemon Reversal, we're trying to play a very disruptive deck. We want to be able to bring up whatever our opponent's setting up. If they get lucky, they do get an early Delcatty, we want to be able to shut that off. Magneton, we want to be able to shut that off. If they're building up, say, a Marsh Tomp or a Combustion on the bench, we want to be able to drag that up, knock it out. Just a very strong card. For energy removal number 2, we want to keep our opponent with as few options as possible. Especially if we're putting a ton of early pressure on them, we want to make sure they're not building something up on the bench that could be a possible threat for us. For Buffer Piece, not only is this going to keep our damage, or keep Regirock from getting as damaged, but also there's a lot of decks in the format, like I talked about, that can deal 100 damage in one turn. Blaziken EX, Swampert EX, for example. This can mess with Gardevoir really well, so that's why I think Buffer Piece is stronger in this deck than, say, a Potion or something like that. We want to be able to throw that under a Regirock and then say, hey, you're not going to knock me out next turn. For Dual Ball, want to be able to find the Regirocks, we want to be able to find the Natus as early as possible. Once again, if we do open with Natu, we have to see that turn 1 Regirock and energy drop, so 4 Dual Ball just increases that. 2 Oak's Research. We already discussed that with the Copycat. Like I said, I think there's a lot of different splits you could do here. 2 Island Cave. The deck is weak to Desert Ruins, and I don't want my body to the Pokebody to go to healing off Desert Ruins, so I do play Island Cave. On top of that, same thing like we talked about with Muck. If you watch that video, a lot of the times if the opponent is struggling to set up, they're going to try to stall, maybe with a Dunsparce Sudden Flash. Maybe you're playing against like Crobat Gorbis, for example, and they're going to, I guess that's a bad analogy because you're going to lose that matchup anyways, but something with special conditions. They're going to try to either stall, put you to sleep, confuse you, buy themselves time to get set up, and Island Cave allows you to play around that, especially if they're setting up a Dunsparce and committing their energy for turn there, and then you're able to Island Cave. Not only are you getting a prize, but you're also completely erasing that last turn's energy drop. One fastball. We do play 4 Xatu in the deck. Hitting them very early is not essential like you see with, say, Muck EX, for example. So the fastball just kind of acts as a 5th Xatu line to help us make sure that we can hit that by that 3rd turn of the game to get it out of the active spot and then bring the Regirock up. Energy, I went with 15 energy here. We go with 13 fighting energy, 1 psychic energy, 1 multi-energy. I went with this because there's no combination of cards that cannot be attached to Regirock. So even if we had, let's say, the most, obscure one, which would be 1 fighting, 1 psychic, 1 multi, that's still going to meet the requirement of 2 fighting and a colorless for Regirock EX to attack. This also allows Za to attack in those kind of French situations like we talked about, either to use Natu Smoothing Wave or Xatu to use Psi Impact. And to be honest with you, Psi Impact is not the worst attack in the world. Some games where if you do randomly get a very early Xatu and that's your go-to option, you can Psi Impact for a couple of turns to put damage on the opponent's Pokemon to try to set them up for one-hit knockouts with Tonnage. On the same token, too, if you are able to get something within 10 HP of being knocked out, this gives you another way to get a prize off the bench with it. So, like I said, you're not going to be attacking with Xatu very often, but it is a cool option for the deck to have. Alright, so that is going to go ahead and wrap up the Regirock deck profile for 2004. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. It's been awesome to see the channel grow over the last couple of months, and I am excited to see it keep growing. Right now we are finalizing the date for the 2004 box tournament. If you guys have not, if everybody hasn't seen that, please check out that video. I'll try to, within the next week, get all the details out on that. But make sure you guys are testing those 2004 decks, and I hope to see you in the next video.